I should note two things at the outset. The first is that I played the trumpet when I was in high school, not the trombone and the tuba, but after a little while they asked me to switch to the baritone horn. I pointed out to the music instructor that none of the pieces we played actually had the baritone horn in it, and he said, you're catching on fast, Stephen. So I just sort of sat there and held it. The other is, you'll have to forgive me that after my remarks I'm going to have to head out because I have a baby daughter and I'm on kid duty tonight. In terms of diplomacy in my household, if I'm not home by 6:30, I think things will get ugly. I've been asked to speak about the role of soft power in terms of counterterrorism, which is a narrower topic than we've just heard from the ambassador, and I'm sure I won't be nearly as erudite. Let me start by saying that one of the most maddening aspects of studying terrorism is trying to define it. Two scholars actually cataloged over 260 definitions for terrorism. Even the US government, different agencies can't agree on a single definition. The ongoing definitional debate, which is decades old at this point, led to one expert's pithy observation that terrorism is, quote, what the bad guys do. I raise that because given how hard it is to find terrorism, it's hardly surprising that we have trouble finding an agreed upon concept of counterterrorism. And too often, I think the US approach seems to resemble a game of whack-a-mole focused on killing the bad guys. And that's not true just for the United States, that's true for other countries around the world as well, including some of, I would argue, America's most important counterterrorism partners. But if one looks at counterterrorism policies and counterterrorism architecture that has existed already before 9/11, especially since 9/11, it's clear that there's more to it than that, or at least there should be. And today, I want to talk about the role of soft power in combating terrorism. Specifically, two areas. One, on how countries use soft power to secure counterterrorism cooperation from one another. And second, more specifically, the role of soft power in how we counter radicalization and recruitment, both internationally and how countries can cooperate to reduce that domestically. Let me start on counterterrorism cooperation, which is a term that we hear a lot. As a matter of fact, anybody who has paid attention to the last couple US counterterrorism strategies will have seen that the concepts of burden sharing and working by, with, and through partners is something that comes up again and again and again. What does it mean to talk about counterterrorism cooperation? How do we actually define that? Because I think that's important before we can talk about the role that soft power and public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy play in terms of security. I would argue that it has several different components. First, it means countries cooperating with one another to help operations that target terrorists, and that's hard power. But that is a component of counterterrorism cooperation, and that curtail illegal activities that support them. And that could be cooperation internationally, or that could be one country cooperating with a second country so that that second country can conduct operations on its soil. Second, I would say that countries seek assistance from one another in terms of cooperation on traditional steps necessary to monitor ports, airports, and borders, right? It's incumbent on country A to make sure that its borders are secure, that its airports are secure, because if we don't control the flow right in our own borders, that can have negative ramifications in a globalized world. Third, there's what I would call tactical cooperation. It's an umbrella term for one country providing access to another, for intelligence cooperation, for cooperation on detainees. These are sort of the nuts and bolts of counterterrorism. Fourth, increasingly, whereas in the past you used to have contributions to military coalitions against state actors, we now have it against non-state actors. The coalition against ISIS had over 60 countries. Also need cooperation to stabilize countries where conflicts have occurred. Diplomatic initiatives to bring conflicts to a conclusion. So for example, there was a big push, right? We continue to have big pushes to find diplomatic solutions to the conflicts in Afghanistan, in Syria. We had a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Mali, and now there's stabilization operations taking place there. And then finally, we have those efforts to keep people from being recruited and or radicalized. So if that's what we mean by counterterrorism cooperation, the different ways in which countries can cooperate with one another, how do we get there? How do we get to counterterrorism cooperation? Well, the most common drivers, if you will, are a sense of shared threats or the provision of incentives, especially assistance. Sometimes economic and development assistance, but often security assistance. Diplomacy, however, and especially cultural diplomacy and soft power, have important roles to play as well. Now, private diplomacy is probably the most obvious, because private diplomacy, you can help broker arrangements that lead to the provisions of assistance or intelligence cooperation. They can help break log jams when they arise. They're critical for getting people on the same page in terms of contributing to a coalition, or getting those regional breakthroughs that I was talking about when you're seeking a diplomatic solution to a conflict. But public diplomacy is important as well, and specifically aspects of public diplomacy that have a cultural component. More broadly, public diplomacy is helpful for signaling, for reinforcing certain messages. But in terms of cultural diplomacy, I would argue that we increasingly, in terms of our interconnected world, see a role for that. You've heard the old adage that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's why it's so difficult to get agreement on a definition of diplomacy. Well, getting a shared cultural sense of what constitutes a threat is absolutely critical if we're going to have agreement, right, on combating those threats. And we see the role of soft power and cultural diplomacy there in terms of state-to-state exchanges that take place, but also in terms of communications via media, and both traditional media and new social media, in terms of how we define these threats and these challenges. It's also important because it can promote a shared understanding of the threat. It's not enough just that two countries share a similar threat from a terrorist group. That's not going to get you all the way. One of the things that's important is how they're going to rank that threat relative to other threats. But another aspect is, how do they understand the causes of that threat? If one country sees a terrorist threat as arising from repression, and another sees it as arising from economic disparities or religion, then they're going to struggle to cooperate against that threat. The degree to which those countries, again, through official exchanges, but also through how their media portrays the threat, how scholars come together to study those threats, how think tanks in different countries may collaborate, all of that can help contribute to a shared understanding of the threat that is necessary to get cooperation against it. Soft power can also help to create what I would call patterns of cooperation. Very often you'll have two countries that will struggle to cooperate. And the degree to which they can come together through various exchanges can help to create relationships, can help to create foundations on which cooperation can grow over time. And this is especially true when it comes to cooperation on things like governance and rule of law, where it can often be more difficult. If you can start by getting just some cooperation at the nuts and bolts level, that can create a foundation for expanding cooperation over time. And again, that comes back to those exchanges which are necessary, to how we talk about these issues in different forums. And that can go a long way towards beginning to promote values related to governance, to rule of law, human rights, in terms of how we handle counterterrorism. You can't just get there by imposing that. You can't demand that. I think we've learned that, especially in the United States. The efforts to promote democracy around the world, I believe, came from a good place during the Bush administration, but they ended up turning off, a lot of countries around the world. And so, I think increasingly during the Obama administration, what we saw was a softer set, a desire to try to build those patterns of cooperation in terms of governance, rule of law, both through official channels, but also through unofficial channels. Encouraging multilateralism, encouraging the free exchange of ideas, encouraging research on these issues. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that just as during the Cold War, that public diplomacy has an important role to play in terms of how one country's ideas are accepted in other places, right? One of the challenges that I believe the United States has faced is that governments are willing to partner with Washington, but their populations are often opposed to this. Public diplomacy is absolutely critical for making it easier for partner governments to work with the U.S. by promoting a more positive concept, idea of the United States, right, among the popular street, as it were. And of course, all of this is contingent on the degree to which a country, in this case America, is able to wield soft power as a result not just of its economic and political clout, but also of its cultural clout. Let me turn now to a more specific area of countering violent extremism, which is, I know, a term that gets bandied about a lot. The United States defines it as, quote, the preventative aspects of counterterrorism as well as interventions to undermine the attraction of extremist movements and ideologies that seek to promote violence, unquote, which is quite a mouthful. So two CVE practitioners who, in the interest of full disclosure, are also friends of mine, offered a much more concise definition: reducing the number of terrorist group supporters through non-coercive means. How do we get people to not want to support terrorism, to not want to buy in to violent extremism without using coercion, without using force? And again, we see official and unofficial channels that are absolutely critical here. So, an official channel. The Global Counterterrorism Forum was established in 2011, and it brings together 29 different countries at last count, and the European Union. It's a multilateral mechanism to advance the rule of law and to promote best practices on CVE. Again, to build those patterns of cooperation specifically on how countries can work together to reduce the risk factors for radicalization. Now, unlike the other aspects of counterterrorism, especially counterterrorism cooperation, where governments and their security forces and their intelligence services are the main and often sole players, CVE includes cooperation from local communities and civil society. As a matter of fact, I would argue that civil society is in many ways the most important, the most critical player here. CVE, when it's most successful, builds from the ground up, right? It's grassroots as much, if not more, than it is grass tops. Civil society organizations and other non-governmental actors as well. Religious leaders, teachers, local businesses, okay? And in many cases, other actors as well. So for example, in Mali, musicians have a big role to play, and have played a big role. I was at the U.S. World Islamic Forum put on by Brookings several years ago, and the most packed presentation came from a group of musicians who were talking about how they were trying to build common understanding among different factions in the conflict in northern Mali through music, right? A traditional cultural form of engagement, something that a lot of these different actors could have in common. That's CVE. So, what are some of the specific ways in which these different local communities, civil society organizations can play a role in concert with government? Well, one, right, using things like music or other community-led programs to promote ethnic, cultural, and religious tolerance. I do a lot of work in Pakistan, and every time I go there, some of the most fulfilling meetings for me are with the clerics and civil society organizations working at the community level to try to bring together different sets. That's not international cultural diplomacy, that's local cultural diplomacy. That's how do we find shared understanding. But this takes on an international and really a global aspect when it comes to encouraging governments around the world to see the value in this, to support the value in this. Because it's absolutely critical to improve understanding between antagonistic communities, and that doesn't just mean state to state. That can mean village to village. That not only reduces radicalization or the risk factors for radicalization, it also reduces the potential for conflict, which terrorist groups can take advantage of. Cultural diplomacy, again, at the community level and at the global level, can promote common values. Governments politically will often struggle to promote their values, but through culture, through soft power, they can create, at the very least, bless you, the conditions in which people will be more open and more amenable to understanding the importance of human rights, good governance, rule of law. And I'll close on this, which is to say, I could not agree with the ambassador's previous presentation when he was talking about, this concept of a global community, that it's not just the United States or any one country putting these ideas forth. We are today at a time, and this is, I think, especially true when it comes to combating terrorism, to countering violent extremism, where we need a whole of society approach. And that society can be at the community level, it can be at the national level, it can be at the global level. And that's got to be an approach that brings together countries, not just bilaterally but multilaterally, but also countries working not with one another, but also with private sector, with local leaders, with civil society, all together to develop a common culture in which we recognize and agree on, if not one single definition of understanding, then at least commonality of what it means to pose a terrorist or extremist threat, where it's coming from, and how to combat it. And I'll stop there. Thank you.